Welcome to Tales from SYL Ranch Live, where everyone is entitled to my opinion, and I'm Bill Stone. Well, tonight on this special live QUARAN stream, we're going to have a discussion about what is and what isn't camp humor and science fiction. Also going to talk about the state of the food distribution system in the United States and what it means to you. And we'll otherwise have excitement, adventure, and really wild things. So, it doesn't look like I've got much of anybody in here, so I will do what I usually do to kill a little bit of time while people discover that the stream is here and show up. I will explain my show. Tales from SYL Ranch is a science fiction, fantasy, horror, superhero, and other genre-related review show. Sometimes I review serious films and TV, sometimes I review schlock, and sometimes I review modern films with a broad appeal, such as Star Wars movies, Marvel movies, The Orville, Doctor Who, and lately Batwoman, which comes back next week as the modern-day Plan 9 from outer space. I do not watch nor review Star Trek because Star Trek is no longer Star Trek, and I've talked about that in a video, and there is a link to that in my description box. For classic films or TV, I usually stick to a period from about 1900 to 1980, and that's because the period after that is pretty well documented. However, 1900 to 1980 contains quite a lot of science fiction and a lot of science fiction fandom that isn't very well documented, so part of the reason I do the show is to document it. Most of my reviews are pre-recorded. However, for special occasions such as this or my live bat streams for Batwoman, I will do a live stream. I will take, under these circumstances, any and all questions, comments, and nasty remarks. I will respond to as many people as possible, and you can tell me if I miss something, if I'm completely full of crap, or if I'm just an amazingly hoopy prude. I do, in my reviews, go into a lot more depth than any other reviewer on YouTube. I do not just say if I like the film or not. I go into the acting, the direction, the cinematography, and all the mechanics of making a film. And I can do this because, a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, I was once an actor, so I can speak with a little authority. Not as much as a modern working actor. Never want to give that impression, but with some authority. There's an old saying, those who can do, and those who can't teach. And if you watch my videos for very long, you probably find that it's a little bit like teaching. One thing I don't do is outrage reviews. There are a lot of reviewers on YouTube who are simply actors portraying outrage because they discovered after The Last Jedi that outrage sells. They hate everything with a knee-jerk reflex because the viewers tune in to watch them hate things. But this sets up a weird feedback loop between fans and reviewers, hating and hating and hating back and forth, till eventually nobody likes anything, even if it's any good. But I don't do that. If I like something, I will say why in detail. If I dislike it, I will say why in detail. But I don't do outrage. Unlike other reviewers, I am the adult in this room. On occasion, and tonight is one of those nights, I may veer into some socio-political commentary. And if you've come just looking for science fiction, don't worry, there's going to be a bunch of that. However, be prepared. I've got a big chunk surrounding a virus that I cannot name on YouTube without YouTube taking various actions against my video. This appears to be because of my general political stance, which is neither conservative nor liberal, but rather libertarian, and they don't like that. So they will do stuff to your video in terms of demonetizing, deranking, etc., etc. Not that monetizing is a problem at the moment, but someday it should be, hopefully, maybe. We'll cross my fingers. And if that happens, then they'll demonetize the video for having mentioned this very, very popular in the press, constantly, virus. So instead of calling it by its name that we've been calling it since forever, I will be calling it transporter psychosis. So when you hear me say transporter psychosis, that means I'm actually talking about this virus that I can't talk about without people getting upset. So, not a bunch of viewers yet, so I will gibber on here and just ad-lib a few things. Sometimes people ask, what's transporter psychosis like in my part of the world. I live in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is a city of a metro area of about 355,000. We're about an hour away from a city of Omaha, which is a metro area of about 1 million. So it's not tiny. It's not huge, but it's not tiny. Right now, in my county, where, it's essentially 355,000 more when you call in some of the small towns around it, we currently have 81 confirmed cases. We are now number 5th in the state. Oddly enough, Hall County has now popped up as a very big front runner with 471 cases, 457 cases rather, which is weird. It's kind of weird. Hall County is home to Grand Island, Nebraska. I have not checked. Actually, maybe I'll do that while I'm killing time here. Grand Island, Nebraska population, because I have not looked to see what the population of Grand Island is in a very long time. Yeah, the population is only about 448,520 as of the 2010 census. No doubt it's gone up some since then, but not much. I mean, it's not a big city, and yet it has the most cases of transporter psychosis as anywhere in Nebraska, which is really weird. The next lowest one below it is Douglas County, and that's where Omaha is. Again, that metro area of 1 million. Add in a few more when you get some of the small towns surrounding that are still in that county. So that one having a fair number of cases of transporter psychosis makes a little sense. It's a large area with some level of population density, but Grand Island, I have no idea what's going on out there. Not the slightest clue what's happening out there. Again, we're down all the way at number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with only 81 cases. That still represents about 0.02% of our populace, so it's not a big deal. We don't have any, orders and quarantine orders to stay in place. We're certainly being encouraged to stay home, encouraged to do, social distancing. They've got, the tape lines at all the stores at the checkout registers, and they put up, plastic barriers between the clerks and the customers and all that. But we're not required to stay home. I go out from time to time to get things, for trips and stuff. Like I can now go to a chiropractor. I'll be going there tomorrow, probably to get rid of the backache that I'll be getting tonight. But we don't see anybody doing anything that they don't ordinarily do, aside from the fact that they have closed all of these businesses and put a whole bunch of people out of work, which I'll be talking about later, in fact. In fact, nationwide, we're now up to about something like 20 million people out of work. 20 million unemployed now. That is an astonishing figure. When you compare it against, the entirety of the population of the country. I don't know what the workforce is, but 20 million, I can do a quick calculation just against how, it's big. Let's see, 20 million, 20 million divided by 340 million-ish. It's something like 5% of the total population of the U.S. It's going to be much, much higher when you consider the number of people actually in the workforce, which I don't have that figure in front of me, so I don't know. But the number of people in the workforce, 20 million, is gigantic. It's just gigantic. We erased anything that we had in terms of a good economy. We're going back to at least at least 2008 era type economy, maybe much worse, because I don't think we had 20 million people suddenly put out of work. Just the economy smashed into a brick wall and stopped. And that really should never happen. I'll explain some of that as we go along as well. But oddly enough, in terms of science fictional things, we're sort of between things right now. I get Batwoman, the modern day Plan 9 from outer space, coming back next week. That'll be good in as much as I'll have a good excuse weekly to do live bat streams with her. If you're not familiar with me, I tried doing regular in-depth reviews of that show for a while, and it's just so stupid that it's not worth my effort. It takes me a couple of hours of research at least to do a real good in-depth review. Not worth doing that kind of research for Batwoman. It's too stupid. So I tried doing that and just turned it to drudgery. And then I tried doing a straight-up reaction video to it. I know I'm not the right demographic for that. Reactors are usually younger women. But it turned out kind of like crap, and I didn't like it at all. But rather than just let it go, I decided, okay, I'll just do live streams. I will live stream it as the episode is airing on the East Coast feed, and we can sit down and laugh at the stupid together, because It's really dumb. It's really, really dumb. If you haven't been watching this show, the dumbest thing that they have done so far really is quite amazing. There was a side supervillain, because there's one major villain that has been with this stupid show since the beginning, and it will probably continue to be so as the season goes to all the way to the end. But there was one side villain who had, among other things, the crimes this individual had committed were attempted mass murder of everybody on an elevated train, and conceivably people behind a building station where it was going to crash into, attempted mass murder of several hundred people, credit card fraud to the tune of posting the mayor's credit card number on social media, attempted murder of an entire high school gym filled with people who were there for some kind of prom or homecoming or something. The Batwoman was able to evacuate the gym, however, but the gym still blew up. So we're also now talking about property damage in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So Batwoman goes to catch this person, and it turns out that it's a gay girl from that school. And she had been outed against her will, was having some social problems as a result of it, and so was taking it out by doing all of these nasty, evil things. And Batwoman let her go. Batwoman just said, okay, all right, we're gonna make you do some community service. Not even make you. It wasn't a judge saying it. She says, okay, you go see my alter ego down at the office, Bruce Wayne's office that she's taken over for reasons. And you have to do some nice community service there, and then we'll let you off. What? The showrunners are a gay couple, so I guess the fact that a lesbian couple, I suppose the fact that, when you're gay, especially if you're a woman, that is literally on this show with Batwoman, because Batwoman is gay. Very, very gay, as she's repeatedly said about herself. Apparently being gay on Batwoman is a literal get-out-of-jail-free card. And that only begins to cover it. I have a whole video about how they have now put 2 people in the hospital, one whom is permanently paralyzed, or probably so. Have video for that, how you can contribute to her GoFundMe to help her pay her bills, because her production company isn't doing so. But it was both of these people were sent to the hospital out of sheer incompetence. So not only is it a stupid show in front of the cameras, it's incompetently run behind the cameras. It's just really awful on all levels. But aside from that, we're still in the middle of a lot of things. Doctor Who ended its season. A lot of people really hated that ending. I wasn't so much, although after I got to talking to people about it, my review on that wasn't bad. But after I got to talking to people with it, I kind of figured out, okay, I get why people hated that episode. I don't have the same level of vitriol that a lot of people do about it, but I understand. I think in retrospect, if I were going to review it again today, I would probably include something about the fact that you really shouldn't take away some of the Doctor's mystery. The Doctor needs to have some mystery about him or her. And by taking away that mystery, I think it may be a long-term problem. It also runs into some potential issues with the canonicity of things with respect to how these former doctors has a TARDIS that looks like a police box, when that was established as having been something that in 1963 it got stuck in shortly before the very first episode that we ever saw with Hartnell's Doctor. So I understand why people hated that one. I didn't have quite the same emotional reaction to it, and I thought it was pretty well put together as an episode, as a dramatic narrative, and I was happy to see some level of characterization being happening here, because we haven't seen any in Doctor Who since Chris Chibnall took over. But I do get now why so many people were so angry about that episode, and if I were going to do it again, I would have to go, yeah, I think there's something to be said about not taking away the mystery of the Doctor. She needs to be mysterious on some level. But we're after the Doctor. We are after Star Trek Picard, which I stopped reviewing at episode 5, because, in my opinion, Star Trek is no longer Star Trek. It has embraced nihilism. And when you embrace nihilism, you have just thrown out the only thing that really makes Star Trek Star Trek. Star Trek is intended by a specific design to be an optimistic show. And when you go nihilistic, you have just blown it. It is no longer Star Trek whatsoever. So we're in between shows. Still waiting for the Orville to come back. As people who watched very long know, I was in IT for 40 years, and I have never paid for any subscription service. Yet somehow I have been always able to find these things for free. One of these days, maybe next week, I'm not sure. One of these days, I'm going to do a video about modern software, modern piracy. Not that you should ever do it. No one should ever pirate videos, ever. That would be wrong. But just a report about how it's done. You know, for the sake of educational purposes. You know, have a big disclaimer on my video. Educational purposes only. You know, don't do this. That would be bad. So I may have a video coming up doing this where I do something like that, where I just go through and describe what the modern ways of committing piracy are and why you should never, ever engage in them, ever. That would be wrong. So I may be doing that very soon. It's a video that I've had in mind for quite a while now, ever since I decided that, you know, most of this crap isn't worth paying for. It just isn't. I have a subscription now to one service and only one service, and that is Hulu. And that is because that is where the Orville is moving from season 3, hopefully for the next 10 years. That would be fine with me. And so I want to support the Orville. I want to keep that show going, so I am paying money for that service. It is nice in as much as it means that I don't have to find my entertainment in other fashions. But you know, like, for example, I have been lately, I have been binging both Star Trek Voyager and Star Trek Enterprise. Those were the ones that during their original runs kind of lost me toward the end. The problem wasn't so much the stories, it was the dramatic format. They had gotten very much into a very formulaic A-B plot structure. You know, the A plot structure was something technobabble that was going on, right? You know, oh no, something's happened to the ship. It's technobabbly. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? That ultimately got saved in the last 5 minutes by some technobabble. I mean, it was just predictable that way. And then the B plot was something having to do with characterization for some character or characters. But this characterization was not tied into the A plot in any way. It was just its own little B plot story. And while that wasn't necessarily going to be, you know, predictable every single time, it was the predictability of the format that sort of lost me. So both for Star Trek Voyager and Star Trek Enterprise, it kind of lost me. Enterprise, I didn't watch all of the episodes of Enterprise, every single one of them, until well after the show had finished its run. And I think a lot of Star Trek fans had gotten that way by if the showrunner for the 4th season had been running it all the way through, it might have been different, because he didn't do that A-B plot structure. That just, you know, formulaic. Something wrong with the ship, technobabble. Something going on over here. Never the twain shall meet. See, if you're going to do a good science fiction like that where you have technobabble, then what you have to have is the character development intertwined with the technobabble, so that by virtue of solving whatever the problem may be with the ship, the character learns something about themselves. You can't just be totally disconnected, and that's kind of what lost me. Hey, a drop of truth, how you going? Greetings from Oz. It's 12:18 p.m. there. Well, hey, what are the legalities of VPN providers? They promote video piracy. How are they legal then? Who controls them? VPNs are useful for many, many other purposes. Many, many other purposes besides just piracy. You know, VPNs are used very heavily for when you're like working from home. I've set up VPN services on many, many places that I've worked over the years. When you're working from home, you can't just go over the internet. That is incredibly insecure. There are many, many ways that people can sniff on your you know, what's going on. They can sniff your packets. They can see what's going on in those packets. So what you do is you set up a VPN, specifically between the person who's working remotely and the office, and that way they can have secure transmissions back and forth. VPNs now are used, not only for that. Those were what they were first used for. They're very first and very legitimate and still used today. That's their main legitimate purpose. But they are now used for people who want to, for whatever reason, to maintain some level of privacy. I don't think that's, as purely a privacy thing. I think that's a really good thing to use them for. There are so many places that are monitoring what you do that I think if you can mask it by looking, having this secure traffic that's going over to somewhere in Europe and appearing to pop out of there, that actually does provide you with some additional security. What most people don't know, and I know because I was in it for 40 years. After 9/11, the NSA built an infrastructure that's really quite horrifying. They built an infrastructure in which most of your major internet service providers, all of your social media, big companies like Google, YouTube, etc. Inside of their data centers, they have a caged off area that is referred to as an NSA cage. Anyone in the business knows about these. The NSA cage is where the NSA has a whole bunch of equipment that you cannot touch and you do not know what is. It is caged off. The only people who ever touch it are NSA people. And all traffic in or out of that of that data center goes through the NSA cage, and it is captured and sent to a data center in Utah. The Utah data center has a shocking amount of storage space. We don't know for sure because it's top secret, but my colleagues have calculated that based on the amount of power that it's generating, that it must have enough to explain how much gets off into ridiculously ludicrous numbers that are so high. When you get into gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes, you're so far beyond it that the definition of whatever bytes becomes questionable. Suffice to say that it's enough to store every single transaction anyone makes on the internet, including all their phone calls, and not just the phone calls, metadata like they talk about. I mean the recorded phone calls. And they don't sit there and watch it. What they do is they store it off. They do what's called data mining. They put it off into big databases that are configured such that they can say, okay, I want to know everything about Bill Stone. And it'll pull all that stuff back and plop down a big report about everything I've ever said, done, or otherwise touched on the internet. So VPNs are useful in that regard because it gives you this secure connection that goes outside of the United States. Doesn't stop them from completely spying on you, but it does help stop them. But yes, seeing your point about the piracy. Well, as I say, sometime very soon I'm going to do a video about modern piracy, an educational video. And there's really no way that you can separate out the uses that people use it for piracy from legitimate uses. There's really no way to separate it out. You can't just say, okay, we're going to make VPNs illegal. You can't do that because, like right now for, what's happening with this virus that I can't name by name because otherwise YouTube will do things to my video. I can only call it what I'm going to call it on this show, transporter psychosis. So the people who are currently working at home due to transporter psychosis, they would not be able to work if it wasn't for VPNs. They would just be out of luck. They have to have those VPNs. So you can't just get rid of them. It's like anything else. It is going to be there. People will use it for piracy. And there is nothing you can do about it. Absolutely nothing that you can do about it. I'm unclear as beyond a certain point as in terms of its utility, to be honest. Drop 2 says, poor writing is often saved by these tropes. Time travel equals reset. Other dimensionality equals reset. Omnipotent being and reset, or was it just a dream as in Dallas? Oh, God, you don't even want to talk about Dallas. Yeah, they needed to do that for Doctor Who now. After that last episode last season. Somehow find out that none of that was ever true. I don't know what you do. I don't know how you would do that. The reaction to that was so visceral. But in terms of VPNs, I'm unclear about the utility of them. There are so many other ways to pirate that it don't involve VPNs or anything like that. You know, I mean, I can tell you, you know, again, this is going to be a topic of some kind of video at some point in the near future. And there are sites out there that allow you to upload anything that you want. And then there are other sites out there that index those things. So you might want to go to a site that looks like it's offering every single episode. I watched The Good Place recently. Every single episode of The Good Place, except they're not really. They are indexing these other websites where people have uploaded this stuff and then allowing you to view that through an interface, but it is not them who have the movie or the film or the TV series. So it really skirts this whole notion of what is and isn't piracy and whether it's legal or not, because they are not themselves uploading anything or hosting uploads. Someone else, dozens of someone else's are doing that. All they're doing is indexing them. It's part of modern piracy, and it's why, you know, it used to be a time when I used to do a lot of BitTorrent. Oh, excuse me. BitTorrent. Oh, excuse me. Used to do a lot of that, and now I really only do it if I want to see something in extraordinarily high definition. Some of these sites, you know, you don't get great definition in 720p, maybe 1080p, but not usually. If I want to see something in really good definition, then I maybe go and see what's out there otherwise. But you really don't, you know, it isn't anything you have to worry about most of the time. But again, there's a video for that somewhere in the offing. But yeah, the poor writings that you talk about, yeah, you know, I have a very brief video out there where I impersonate James doing badly, but proclaiming that Star Trek Picard is bad fan fiction. Wouldn't mind if we found out that Star Trek Picard was just a holodeck novel that somebody was running. I'd be all right with that. Let's reset that. Let's take that out. Let's get rid of it. Same thing with Discovery. Anybody who watches me for very long knows I am not a fan of Star Trek Picard nor Star Trek Discovery because they have gone nihilistic. Star Trek was never intended to be nihilistic. I have a video about that. It appears in every single one of my description boxes for every single one of my videos. That Star Trek is no longer Star Trek, and ultimately it boils down to Star Trek has started to embrace nihilism, and that is not Star Trek. Star Trek is always optimistic, not nihilistic. Nihilism is the exact opposite of Star Trek. So I dislike them on that basis. There's also a lot of other reasons I dislike it. You know, I mean, if you're going to do Picard, hey, guess what? The Borg. Well, okay. What a shock. You know, only the most iconic thing to ever go along with Star Trek The Next Generation, the Borg. You couldn't have done something new or original. You had to resort to the Borg because of the ratings. Similarly, Star Trek, you know, Discovery, first season was just a crap fest in my opinion. Second season, and it went, again, we went to the first thing. Okay, what is the first, you know, one of the most iconic things that goes along with Star Trek, the original series? The mirror universe. You couldn't have come up with something more. And the second season, just ridiculous on many, many levels. But, you know, the bright spot being, you know, Anson Mount as Captain Pike. I think he was pretty good. But the rest of it, ridiculous on many levels. And I've been around so long now that I can see a predestination paradox coming a mile away. I called that one in episode 1. First time they saw this red angel, I went, predestination paradox, that's going to turn out to be Michael Burnham. And what a shock, I was right. Dropper 2 said, sorry to see your live streams from the USA, like all of the others, is having buffering issues on my end in Oz. I'm sorry about that. Internet bandwidth is used to the old party line phone systems here. Well, I'm sorry to hear about that. If there's someone else not from Australia that's having problems, let me know. I always hate to have dropped frames and buffering and things like that. I'm not seeing it in my control panel from YouTube, but then again, YouTube tends to lie to me a lot in terms of what it's telling me about the control panel. So sorry about that. I hope it's not a general thing. Hate to have it happen to anybody, but if so, I hope it's just something that's specific to you or your region as opposed to something that's happening on my end. Used to be when I was doing this with a much lower end computer before I got retired, and I got a disability determination and was able to buy a nice brand new little Asus gaming laptop that's really good for graphics and things. I had to be very, very, very careful about my live streams to make sure that they didn't buffer and all kinds of nasty stuff. So sorry that that's happening to you. Hope it goes away, and hope it's not something that's generalized. YouTube control panel down here is telling me it's excellent condition and the stream health is green. It did it 5 minutes after the stream started for about a minute. Gave an unhealthy reading, but again, I have no reason oftentimes to know whether that thing is telling me the truth. I've watched YouTube's control panel lie to me before, so a couple of times it said I've had bad connection, and everybody on the stream says it's fine, you know. Well, I got a couple of viewers anyway, so let's see. Oh, I'm old enough to remember party line phones. Absolutely. Yeah, I'll mention it a little bit later when I get to talking about U.S. agriculture. But when I was spending summers, I spent anywhere from 2 weeks to a month or so out at my grandparents' very, very rural South Dakota cattle ranch. And when I started first going out there for years, they had a party line. If you don't know what that is, if you're not old enough to know what that is, a party line was a single phone line that ran between multiple people. Out there, it was a single phone line that ran all the way from, up line. There were at least 2 other, neighboring ranches, and then my grandparents, and then downstream ranches. There were probably 3 more. God, probably like 5 at that point. So if the phone rang, you never knew if it was for you or someone else on your party line. And anybody could pick up the party line at any time, and so I don't quite know how that worked, other than, somebody would pick it up. If it was for them, they'd say, okay. If it wasn't, they'd say, I'll call back and I won't pick up. And after a few times calling, the person would hit whoever it was that the phone call was supposed to go to. Yeah, that's how long I've been in telecommunications, all right. I remember that. I don't remember when that finally got rid of out there. Sometime in my teens, I think, when they finally went to individualized lines out there. But that was very, very rural South Dakota, behind the times even for then. Extremely rural. Out there, the nearest paved road was 40 miles away. It's not far from where my family has some ranch land still in the family. It's got a small cabin on it that I like to go to just for kicks and relax and kick back from time to time. That is 2 miles to the nearest gravel road. It is ruts, just ruts in the ground from where people have been out checking cattle for decades with their pickup trucks, and it is ruts for 2 miles until you get to the gravel road. Then the gravel road's another 40 miles to a paved road, and then it's about another 10 or 15 miles from there into the tiny town of Wall, South Dakota. Famous for Wall Drug, if you've ever heard of it all. Really sleepy little town, except during tourist season, and then it becomes a giant tourist trap where they are ripping you off for every last dime that they can get out of you. It is a pure tourist trap. People who live in the area don't buy stuff from Wall Drug or any place around there unless they absolutely have to during tourist season, because it's a perfect way to get completely ripped off. Well, let's see. Good morning, Marshal President. I may begin now. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I actually was going to get to a bit of my pre-scripted stuff here. Drop of Truth says it's an Aussie issue. Oh, we are at the opposite side of the world with only one very large subterranean optical fiber connecting us to the rest of the world. Really, I'm surprised by that. Would have thought that you would have at least had, things like stuff going on with satellite and things. But, you never know. You can never tell what the actual infrastructure for something looks like unless you've been working on that infrastructure. So. But I will go ahead, get into something that I had planned here that is at least kind of science fiction-y. It's something that kind of bothers me. It's something that just kind of bothers me, and I thought I'd make a quick mention of it. My gravity is backwards. That's all. Stand on your head. It will clear up. Yeah. Yeah, no, God, don't get into don't get into that, because that's actually what flat earthers think. You know, how can the world be round? It would mean that people would be upside down on the other side of the world, and how would that happen? He's like, you morons, you can't explain gravity to them. They don't understand. Well, gravity's just flat. It's pulling you down. It's just magic. Don't ever get into flat earthers, because I've done it. I've looked at what their bizarre worldview is. It makes sense only from their bizarre perspective. It doesn't make any sense within the context of any scientific laws or theories about which I am familiar. So, okay, the thing that tends to bother me just a little, it's that, most modern fans tend to consider older science fiction campy. And I'm really generally annoyed at this when you apply it to Star Trek, the original series. Very little science fiction is actually camp. Camp is an intentional kind of humor, and the best example of this always is the 1960s Batman TV series. That is a camp TV show. Not even the 1930s Flash Gordon serials are actually campy. They are not trying to be amusing. In fact, in their era, they were intended to be and were taken seriously. They were certainly children's fare. They were not, adult themes or anything like that you would have seen, adult film that you would have seen around that time. But they weren't trying to be intentionally amusing. They were trying to be a serious adventure for those kids, and for most of the time they were. Kids of that era could get into Flash Gordon the way that we might get into, Star Wars today. They could become emotionally invested in it. And I mean the first Star Wars movies. The franchise and the cultural thing that it turned into is a whole other thing. But, as a kid being able to get into, that film when I was 12 years old, similar to the way that my great-grandparents maybe would have gotten into Flash Gordon. But if you want to compare this, the 1980 Flash Gordon movie is the one that stars Sam J. Jones. That is camp. It is intentionally trying to be amusing in a campy way. But Star Trek's never been camp, not in any incarnation, not ever. The only place in Star Trek that you see camp is in the Captain Proton serials that you see from time to time in Star Trek Voyager. Captain Proton is camp, absolutely. But Voyager itself is not. All you're really seeing in older Star Trek, like Star Trek the original series, is a number of things. First is lower production standards. And that's because no one at that time ever imagined that anyone would ever be viewing these episodes in 1080p. When you see these in 1080p, you are watching in better quality than they watched in the dailies on a screen the day after they shot them. You are seeing better quality there. These episodes were designed to be viewed on a crappy, low-definition analog broadcast television. And on the best of days, the picture was never going to be crystal clear. And if you got a thunderstorm, it would be a nightmare. If your mother ran the vacuum cleaner, it would be a nightmare, because they would be susceptible to all manner of electromagnetic interference. If you were too close to the transmitter, it would be bad. If you were too far away from the transmitter, it would be bad. Even if you were in the middle, you are still looking at crappy, low-def, analog broadcast television. Like. Oh, hey, Larry. Nice to see you tonight, too. But you simply couldn't make out the kind of detail that you can today. So the show was made with the TV production standards of that era in mind, and it wasn't anything unusual. If you go watch Bonanza, which was a much more successful program that ran concurrent, among other things, Bonanza was an incredibly long-running show. If you go watch Bonanza, you will see lots of horses on what are obviously sound stages in 1080p. They were taking exactly the same shortcuts because they never expected that this stuff was ever going to be viewed in 1080p. Dropper Truth says you live in Albury. I'm not sure what NSW is. I'm afraid I am a silly, stupid American who doesn't know what New South Wales. That's what it is. Sorry, I wasn't remembering off the top of my head. So always nice to see people who come in from other countries and help us. Yes, Bonanza was created to sell color TVs. Bonanza predated color TVs. But yeah, it was one of the selling points, absolutely. Very, very popular program. Much, much more so than Star Trek ever was. But again, if you watch those episodes now, yeah, they have some better production values when it gets into things like, doing interior sets. But they're period pieces, from the era that it's portraying. We get out into the open. Sometimes they do have some stuff that's on location. And sometimes they have horses walking in on sound stages with, AstroTurf, the same as they did on Star Trek. It was never intended to be seen in 1080p, not ever. Nobody ever thought it was, and hell, if they'd known back then that they were going to deal with a franchise that would start then, it would last more than half a century, they would have done something very different with it, I'm sure. Second thing you deal with in Star Trek, the original series in particular, and lots of science fiction, a lot of the older science fiction that I review, if it's any good, is dated technological predictions. And what modern fans don't really understand is that even in the 1960s, this is what the best futurists of that era predicted. Everybody kind of agreed that this is where we were heading. They were thinking that we would have an imminent breakthrough in power generation. But what we actually got was a massive breakthrough in information technology. Back then, they assumed nuclear power was going to make everything else pretty much obsolete. It would get smaller. We'd have, spaceships that were driven by nuclear-powered engines. And then they assumed also that computers would always be the size of a warehouse, because that's the size of computers were back then, was the size of a warehouse. And they could not do what your phone in your friggin' pocket can do. They were huge. Let's see. Drop Tooth says party lines in Perth, Western Australia were phased out around 1985. That may have been about when it happened in rural South Dakota. I don't know. I don't remember it that well. It's now been so long. I'm not sure if I was in high school. Maybe it was a little before that. So, sci-fi novels rarely predict the future. No sci-fi ever predicts the future correctly. But that's what you see in Star Trek. They thought they were going to have a big breakthrough in power and that computers were always going to be huge. But what we actually got were very few nuclear plants, and then we got giant breakthroughs in computing that allowed us to put this in your pocket, which is more computing power than it took to put man on the moon, by far, by several orders of magnitude. Then a third thing that you deal with in older science fiction, and Star Trek in particular, is the effects, special effects that have advanced. Most people don't know this, younger fans don't know, but Star Trek, the original series, was completely groundbreaking in terms of science fiction, its effects, and it would remain that way for a good 10 years or so until Space 1999 came around in the 1970s. Now, of course, today a good special effects artist can create better effects using a single computer and a CGI, but if you really insist on belittling the original series based on its special effects, just remember this. In 20 years, your kids or your grandchildren are going to belittle modern Kurtz Trek and its special effects for exactly the same reason. Things will advance, and the kids will go, wow, that looks fake and stupid and cheesy and hokey. Another big factor is that storytelling, the way that stories have told themselves, have changed. Star Trek, the original series, was very dialogue heavy for a couple of reasons. Drop of Tooth says early optic fiber connections to the cities sorted that out. However, most homes today still have copper from the node, like me, about 50 megabit per second is the best I have. Here in Lincoln, Nebraska, we have fiber to the curb for one. Actually, no, I'm sorry, it's fiber to the home. I'm not on it right now. I'm paying for the internet in the home in which I live, which I share with my mother. Yes, I'm living in my mother's basement for a variety of reasons. And I'm paying for it now, and I'm always about this close to upping to the fiber, because that would increase my bandwidth rather dramatically. But yeah, that's what we have here, fiber right into the house. Fiber to the router is what it is. So Star Trek, one of the ways that storytelling's changed is Star Trek, the original series, was very dialogue heavy, and that was for a couple of reasons. One of them was to make up for the fact that they couldn't do certain types of effects. They had to talk about what was happening and the effects of whatever was going on because they could not technologically do those special effects. It was impossible at that time. USA Larry says has miles and miles of dark fiber. Yes, that's true. I watched them put fiber in to North Sioux City. Why? The company that did that went out of business, and the fiber was dark. It may still be dark. North Sioux City, South Dakota is a tiny, tiny town in real life. Marshall says with CG's trajectory, we will be able to generate CG actors that don't get paid $30 million a movie or will look completely real. Time frame 10 years or so. Yeah, I agree with you, Marshall. I keep thinking, eventually they're gonna circle back around to Star Trek: The Original Series, and we will be seeing William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelley playing their signature roles, and we will never know the difference. They will be completely real looking. Drop Truth says Larry 1984 and Brave New World were pretty spot on, but then they were written by Fabian socialist insiders. 1984 certainly is starting to come true. That's they were a little off by the decades, but in any case, the scripts are dialogue heavy in the original series, partly because they had to make up for the fact that they could not show these effects. Some of them were impossible to make, so you had to have the characters talking about what was happening and how it was affecting the ship or whatever was around it. Secondly, it was dialogue heavy because a lot of the writers, not all of them, but a lot of them had come either from literary science fiction. Some were literary science fiction authors who had been asked, hey, would you write for this show, because they wanted to have quality scripts. Or they were people who had previously written quite a lot of radio. Now, obviously, a written narrative is going to be more heavily influenced by words. So if you get somebody coming out of the literary world, they're going to be more into words. And radio, well, it had been the television of its era for a couple of decades. They had everything that we have on TV now. They have, they had dramas, comedies, sitcoms, soap operas. They even had reality TV shows. They had cop shows. The difference, of course, is detective shows, everything, science fiction. The difference was that they didn't have any kind of visual medium to it, and so they were more dialogue heavy by necessity. So if you get people who are coming out of that and coming out of a literary tradition, then you're going to have a Star Trek that is more heavy on dialogue than it's going to be on special effects. Shuttle Galileo had to wait until they built a real one. Yeah, the whole issue of the Shuttle Galileo was interesting. Back here, Marshall says, we know they aren't real, others may not. Yeah, Marshall says, Drop Deuce's more royalty fees, and Drop Deuce says, Arnie had himself fully 3D body scan about the time of Terminator 3. Yeah, they won't need the full 3D body scan at all. They'll just be able to recreate these people based on existing footage. Kind of what they, maybe with, I don't even know that they'll need another actor. It was done kind of eerily and in not a good way for Rogue One with Grand Moff Tarkin. Give it another 10 years, like Marshall says, and we would not be able to tell the difference. Who knows? Knowing the Lucas tradition, they may just go back and redo Grand Moff Tarkin for that movie so that it doesn't look quite so kind of creepy. But that's one of the things about it. And then, of course, is the fact that in modern writers, they can take advantage both of modern visual effects, and they also come to this with a long tradition now of how they tell stories in a more visual way. With a visual medium, it is always better to show rather than just tell. And so the writers themselves come at this with this, okay, we need to show, not tell, show, not tell. And we have, more money than God, and we can do all the CGI that we want to do. But all of this taken into account, this is why none of this makes Star Trek: The Original Series anything like camp. It makes it an older show with different assumptions about the future, with different technological limitations in terms of filmmaking, and a different way of telling a story. But it is not camp, and it never was. Now, in 50 years, if people are still watching Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard, I have no doubt that younger fans will say that it's campy, because it will look fake and stupid and hokey looking, and it will not match the future as it actually came true. They will lack the perspective to understand that it's not. Drop of Truth says the live stream is currently clashing with Nerdrotic and Doomcox, the Inquisition discussing on Westworld, unduly negative and filled with vehement spite as always. I just lost one of my glasses lenses. Well, isn't that special? I lost a screw. Well, I'll find it later. Yeah, that's what I always mention at the top of my show. They're outrage reviewers. They are outrage reviewers. I don't know how much of their outrage is real. I know that there are a lot of YouTubers who are just acting like they're outraged because after The Last Jedi, they found out that really sells. So I don't know how much of their outrage is real. I don't get into Westworld because it's on like season 3, and it's another one of these shows, and I have several that I really need to binge watch. I'm not going to start reviewing those from one because I'll be so far behind that nobody will want to watch it. I've been binge watching a number of shows with the intent to start doing them when they come back, or very shortly. But I'm not going to even talk about Westworld until I have an intelligent way to talk about it. But when you get into those guys, they tend to be outrage reviewers. And I don't know how much of their outrage is genuine and how much it's playing to an audience that expects to hear outrage out of them. Sucrew63 says you're waiting for the Axnar films. Alec Peters knows what real Trek is. Yeah, I think he has a good handle on that. I'm not a giant fan of his because of where he fell down on the Kick Vic thing. I was not there. I don't know. I can't say one way or the other because I wasn't there. I don't know. But I always try to give people, innocent until proven guilty. And so far, nobody that they've come up with in terms of somebody's they say it was actually harassed by Vic, seems to have actually been sexually harassed by Vic. He gave a lot of people hugs, and nobody seemed to mind that. His ex-fiancée is very down about him on it. But having been divorced and knowing how that can kind of work, somebody's ex being down on you doesn't surprise me. So I tend to, all right, let's just push that away. It doesn't matter. I think Alec Peters is making some good stuff. The trailers I've seen look good. I'm just not a huge fan of his because he and I actually got into an altercation. It's a verbal one, sparring back and forth on Facebook about it. And I was like, well, do you have anybody here that would take him to court? Do you have anybody here who will swear that this happened to them? And when you get down to the details, no, you didn't. Nobody's saying that a lot of people said that Vic's been had sexually harassed somebody. But when you get down to the somebodies, they say, no, I don't think it's sexual harassment. He gave me a big hug. I was thrilled with that. Drop of Truth says, outrage always plays to the lowest common denominator, gets boring real fast. I tend to agree, but I think probably one of the reasons that I don't have such a big following is because I'm not doing outrage videos. I'm being as level-headed as I can. Sometimes I get emotionally invested, like when I get angry about Star Trek Picard and Star Trek Discovery. But even then, I try to bring it down to here is why. I'm emotional about this, but here is why. Here are the details of why it is. Anyway, getting back to science fiction in general. See, it looks like Larry mentioned that, I think it was he that mentioned that science fiction never gets things right. I'll answer your question about The Expanse in just half a second. I want to get through this just for a second here, Drop of Truth. But as Larry mentioned, the sole commonality in all of science fiction is that it always gets the future wrong. There are no exceptions. And the farther away in time you get from when it was produced, the more wrong it becomes. The best thing that you can hope for is that the basic story will remain engaging enough to carry a viewer through the dated predictions of the future or the technological limitations or assumptions of when it was made. Because even the coolest shows or movies of today will appear dated and wrong and technologically silly inside of about 20 years. There are just no exceptions to that. This is why, by the way, you should always listen to FANDI Masters, such as myself. We have watched, read, and listened to over 100 years worth of science fiction, and so we do have the proper perspective to put this into. You can just never judge any science fiction by modern standards. You always have to judge it in the context of the era in which it was made. Drop of Truth, The Expanse. Yeah, that's another one that I'm going to get into because I've now binged all that. I'm going to get into that when it comes back. I think it's coming back for another season. But I'll be getting to The Expanse, doing reviews of that. In general, I have liked the show. It is as close as you're going to get to what's called hard science fiction on television or films. It's when they do things, particularly with gravity, acceleration, deceleration, stuff like that, it all makes perfect sense. It's not what you usually see in science fiction. Well, usually just to make life easier, you assume, okay, we've somehow found artificial gravity so everybody stays vertical. But they don't, obviously. And so I like the show very much on that level. When they get minor punctures in a ship from a micrometeorite, that doesn't mean that everybody goes flying out, because that's not what happens in real life when you have a sudden reduction in cabin pressure in something that's only this big. You have all the time in the world generally to put a patch over it, and you don't even need much of a patch. So a lot of the science in that I like very much. I generally have been engaged by the stories. It's slower paced than a lot of science fiction is, but that's because they're taking such care with the science that goes behind it. And it tickles that part of my brain because as a scientist, it kind of tickles that part of my brain, and I like it a lot. I felt by the end of that last season, season 4, I felt like it had, I was not as nearly emotionally satisfied by the end of that season. It felt like it had suddenly just been cut short in the middle. And I did, and the other seasons, they had, endings that were left open as well. But this one, it just felt like it cut off in the middle. And I wasn't happy about that. I wasn't as emotionally satisfied by the end of that season. Super63 says, The Expanse is awesome. Unfortunately, most stuff does have politics in it. Original series had it almost all the time. Yeah, but at least it's not all woke crap. Yeah, I agree. It's not real woke and nasty. Drop of Truth says, I was happily surprised by how good Lost in Space Season 2 was. A vast improvement on Season 1. Another one that I'm having to binge watch so that I can review it in the future. As I say, I've got several that I'm binging that way. The Feed is also excellent. I guess I'll have to check that out. I'm not sure what the Feed is. There's so much out there anymore. But these are all things that I need to start reviewing during this sort of desert period between other shows. But again, these are things I want to binge them first so that I'm up on it, so that I'm not reviewing episodes that are really old. That's not a good way to keep a channel and build it. You want to start out with whatever's current that freaking week and get it out. My general thing is I want to have a review out there within 2 to 4 hours of when it airs, but that isn't always possible, depending on the amount of research I have to do, because I talk about, acting, the direction, the cinematography. If it's something new, if it's a new character, I go through a lot of what they've done in the past, and so that you can say, okay, well, this guy's capable of doing some really good work, or oh my God, they played that. Wow, I can't believe they got hired again. If a cinematographer has a lot of stuff under their belt, and you can see that they're bringing that to this and making it better. So I do a fair amount of research for that sort of thing, but I so far have been generally able to get my reviews out generally before much of anybody else. It's just that I don't yet have the viewership so that people are flocking over to see me, or I'm boring, or old, or one of them three. Let's see. Drop2 says, Devs, however, is dull, listless, poorly acted, badly written, and it would seem the most budget was spent on the sets and the actors were an afterthought. I have, as I've mentioned before, I have one streaming service account, and that is for Hulu, and that is because I want to support the Orville, and I have tried watching Devs. I have not really yet been able to get through a full episode. It has not engaged me so far. I will probably sit down and try to do some more, but so far I tend to agree Devs has not been that engaging for me. Most of the budget, my grammar is near perfect, but my typing is crap. Well, it's no problem. That's Marshall and I type for a living, so we're about the only ones who usually get it right. And even then, I screw it up. So, well, let's see. It's about 10 p.m. I tell you what, I am going to veer off from science fiction for a little bit. Sorry, I'm looking to see if I can find this freaking screw that I lost. Fortunately, I have another pair of glasses. I just don't want to go and get them. It's just that, see, it's so weird seeing it because my vision is so bad in one eye. So I'm going to veer off of this for a minute because I want to talk about something else that's more about this virus that I can't discuss without having YouTube do things to my videos because of my political leanings. They will derank and potentially, if I ever got monetized, demonetize the video and do all kinds of mean, nasty, ugly things to it because they don't like my political perspective. And I am a libertarian. I am not a conservative nor a Republican. I am or a Democrat. I am a libertarian. But that does not toe their party line. And so if I refer to this virus that is going around, that is constantly in the news, as its name, then I will have problems. So for purposes of talking about this virus, I will call it transporter psychosis instead. Drop of Truth says, have there been any lawsuits filed over the injuries on Batwoman's set yet? Not that I'm aware of. I don't know. I haven't been following it that much after I did that one video about how incredibly fracking incompetent that production is. I said earlier, probably before you got in, Drop of Truth, that is, not only is Batwoman just the modern Plan 9 from outer space in terms of what they're making, they have an incredibly incompetent production staff. They've sent 2 people to the hospital with spinal issues, and one of them is now actually managed to paralyze her. I haven't kept on it very hard. I've had other things on my mind, mostly transporter psychosis, since that's what I'll be calling it. So I want to talk about transporter psychosis. You can see my episode is entitled Episode 2, Attack of the Starvation. There's a reason for that. Due to the economic fallout from transporter psychosis and the panic that has accompanied it, it is becoming more and more likely that you may die of starvation. And you probably don't understand why this is. One must understand, first of all, that America's farmers and ranchers feel they feed not just the United States, but also the entire world. Without our current level of agricultural productivity, it is not hyperbole to say that 1 billion people or more would starve to death worldwide. Lawsuits, I'll go into Hillary Clinton route and blame it on my keyboard. If you listen to Hillary Clinton, she doesn't even know what a keyboard is. But I digress. Tales from SYL Ranch here is not based in one of America's large metro areas. I did live in one, Chicagoland, for a good 10 years. It is based, however, in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is a metro area of about 355,000 people. And we are half an hour away from Omaha, which is a metro area of about 1 million. But while I did spend my entire 40-year IT career, that's what I did for a living, I do have an agricultural background. From ages 5 to 15, I spent anywhere from 2 weeks to a month on my grandparents' working cattle ranch in South Dakota. And I also have family members who are still in the beef industry field as ranchers. And while this in no way qualifies me as an agricultural expert, it does at least give me sort of grounding so that I can talk about it. And this is something that people in a lot of metro areas lack. Now, explaining the economic issues to urbanites involves a great deal of re-education. I must also overcome something of the entirely inaccurate perception that urbanites tend to have of modern agriculture. For example, right at the top, what I'm wearing here today, this is a costume. I'm always clear about it. This is a costume. This is me trying to push an image. Nobody that I know wears this sort of thing. We wear t-shirts and jeans just like everybody else. The moment I'm done with this, I'm going to take it off, put it off in my closet, and put back on the NASA t-shirt that I was wearing today. So if you're an urbanite, which is statistically likely watching me, I would ask that, in the immortal words of Yoda, you allow yourself to unlearn what you have learned. Modern ranchers and farmers often tend tracts of land that are larger than either the New York City or Los Angeles metro areas. And doing this requires a lot of modern science, which is why most of the people doing this have degrees in agricultural science and or agricultural engineering. They are not uneducated in rural areas. They have bachelor's degrees that require the same breadth of subject matter as any other bachelor's degree would require. Much of modern agriculture and its science is also involves operation of heavy equipment, as you can see some of which over my shoulder, as this is really the only way to possibly tend tracts of land that large. And this equipment, it's diesel powered. Remember that for anybody who wants to go to a Green New Deal and take away all gasoline. There is no equipment that would run electric to do this. And due to the remoteness, sometimes, like my grandparents' former ranch, the remoteness of this land, farmers and ranchers often maintain their own large supply of diesel fuel on site. They'll have one of those big diesel tankers come out once a month or so, fill up this big tank they have of diesel fuel, and then use that to power all of this equipment that you're seeing here. And they will generally work from dawn until dusk because the sun is the only source of illumination out there on the prairie. And this is the only way that it's possible to get our current agricultural output, which literally, not figuratively, feeds more than 1 billion people worldwide, sun up to sundown, using diesel-powered equipment. Now, in terms of cattle ranching specifically, the transporter psychosis, the panic of it is beginning to collapse the food supply chain. It's mirrored in other agricultural industries, but I can talk about it with a little bit of authority just because my own experience and my family history. Now, at present, here's how meat gets to your table. If you're in a metro area, anywhere really for that matter, it's not like we're going around slaughtering our own cattle here. It's produced in multiple different stages. First, you have what's called a cow-calf operation, and this is what my grandparents had, and this is what several of my family members are still in. And this is where cattle are bred by ranchers and then allowed to free-range graze for several years. After that, they are transported to an auction house by the millions by diesel-powered semi-trucks, and this is a pretty standard auction house. Auction house itself is fairly small buildings, but all the rest of this is nothing but cattle in pens. Then, after they're auctioned at the feedlot, they are sold to the auction house. They're sold to a feedlot where they are transported via diesel-powered vehicles. And this is where they don't free-range graze. You can kind of see it here. They are fed feed grains instead. Now, this is because consumers don't like the taste of free-range cattle. Free-range cattle only really eat grass, and that makes them taste very kind of tasteless and stringy. I've had occasion to do it on one particular Christmas that I recall. My grandparents slaughtered a cow and gave a big section to each of their 5 children. So we were eating grass-fed cows for a long time, meat for a long time, and it was kind of tasteless and stringy. So what the feed grains do is alter the muscle tissue of these cattle to be consistent with what a consumer wants to eat. So after a couple of years there, they go back to the auction house where they're transported again by diesel-powered vehicles, and they're sold to meat processing plants. And this is an interior of a standard meat processing plant, and in fact behind me I have a green screen of an empty meat processing plant. They're transported via these diesel-powered trucks to the processing facilities where they are then slaughtered and turned into the kind of meat that you'll find in your grocery store. And the processing plants, they use basically large electric-powered generators, usually multiple ones on site. They have to keep things pretty cold, and it has to be in a controlled environment, so they do that. After processing, the meat is transported to wholesalers who package them and put them into these large freezers. Temperature in these freezers is generally about 20 degrees minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. generally powered by electrical generators on site. They don't spend a lot of time here. And that's because on demand, the meat is then transported via diesel trucks to grocery stores. And on demand just means that your local grocery store only keeps about 3 days worth of supply on hand to service normal customer operations. Modern grocery stores don't even have the freezer capacity necessary to hold more than just about 3 days. But modern IT, we've done this for them, allows them to order things as needed. As they get low, they immediately order more, which makes the grocery stores much more efficient. They keep only on hand what's necessary rather than having to keep too much inventory, which can spoil, or too little, which means they can't service their customer demand. Check up on my things here. Supercruise63 says, my friend is a nurse and says that people that go into the hospital get tested reported positive until the test comes back negative, and people that die from almost anything is reported as transporter psychosis. Yeah, exactly what's being reported and how they're tallying that up is a matter of some debate. You know, like my mother, she's old enough that she is immunocompromised by a number of different things. If anything happens where I get even a sickness where I'm sneezing or the flu, I'm out of this house because I don't want to give it to her, because it can turn into pneumonia and can be deadly because she's immunocompromised. So you get people who are immunocompromised. Well, you might say, okay, they died from COVID, but actually what happens is it turned into something else because they were immunocompromised. Dropper 2 says the tree-hugging dropkicks, the Greens in South Australia, are pushing all electric vehicles by 2030, not realizing that 80% of Australian electricity is made by coal-fired plants. What morons. It's the same here. They don't understand where if they really want to get rid of as much use of fossil fuels, go nuclear. That's the only way to go. It's safe. It's effective. Supercruise63 says, due to higher financial reimbursement from said psychosis. Yes. What is drop of truth? What is transporter psychosis? Yeah, I can't, because I don't have a liberal stand on this. I cannot use the word that is this virus that we all know we're talking about, because YouTube stands for that, and if you aren't towing their party line, they will do things like de-rank your videos, stuff like that. So for people like me, I have to refer to it by some other name. And this being sort of a science fiction show, I decided that I'm going to call this virus that is all over the world, that we all know what is, transporter psychosis instead. So, one interesting thing to remember here is, this has to give you some idea of the, excuse me while I move a couple of things around, of the scale of the beef industry just in my local area. This map here represents the path taken from near where my grandparents' cattle ranch used to be to an auction house all the way across the state. And I know that because I once had occasion to accompany several semi-trucks worth of cattle all the way from here to there. So I know that that exists. They went that far to get to the auction house. Part of the reason they did that is because the beef meat processing plants are up here in Sioux Falls. But this distance here all the way down there is about 400 miles. Now, for purposes of scale, I have included both the New York City, that's this bluish part above here, and Los Angeles for scale. In point of fact, both of them are about the same geographic area as Sioux Falls, South Dakota, whose metro area is only about 266,000 people, so obviously much, much less dense population. But, when you look at it, it's just something I like to, show to urbanites. You may think that you're the center of the universe, but in reality, there is a whole other large, gigantic country out there that you are not. You are, in fact, a small thing geographically. Large population-wise, but small geographically. One other thing I'd point out is the first 40 miles of this road from, this area here to Wall, about from here to there, is just gravel road. It is not well maintained. It's graded by the county from time to time, but it's nothing like a paved road. And that's been the way it is my entire life and preceding me for a long, long time. Glance over here. Let's see. Power in all its forms is the prime resource. Without power, those cows couldn't get more than 100 miles from their source before they were unsellable. Absolutely. Drop says water, then food, then power. Power companies make more than drug cartels do it legally. License to supply power is a license to enslave. To be honest, the power actually comes before the water and the food. If you're free-range grazing cattle, hopefully you have a water supply nearby in the form of a river or a lake or something like that. But in South Dakota here, South Dakota does not get a ton of precipitation. It's a natural prairie for a reason. There aren't any really large bodies of water. The river that you're seeing running through there is the Missouri River, and it's not that big most places. The ranch that my grandparents had was near what's called the Cheyenne River, and that was a source of water, but not all the time, because you can't just have this large area that you own with no fences. You have to fence things off for a variety of reasons. You let your cattle graze in one area for part of the year until it's kind of grazed out, move them over to another for a part of the year until that's kind of grazed out. But you have to have water in there. And so you get water from the town. They Wall or Mitchell, I'm not sure which one of them, but they run underground water out there. And those go into big watering tanks, so that your cattle have somewhere to drink water when they are not able to get to the river and down there. In point of fact, and the part that's still in my family, it'd be tough to get them down to the river, in point of fact. So you have to have that, and that requires then the power to push all of that stuff out through the pipes hundreds of miles, without any problems. Power actually becomes more important, and the same thing with feeding the cattle. Yeah, they can graze during the summer, but come winter, you better have yourself a whole lot of hay cut down. And you have to use very large tractors and all kinds of stuff that are going to be diesel powered in order to do it. You have to have that power. You cannot maintain the agricultural output that we have today without the power. But I would certainly prefer to see us going to a model that allowed the power to be more localized rather than centralized. And I think having power companies that are monolithic, that have some license that only they can provide power in a certain place, I think that's probably a bad thing. I think if you had competition, it would be quickly be a lot cheaper. But anyhow, back to my discussion of the food supply chain. Now, most Americans have been living paycheck to paycheck most of their lives while simultaneously running up credit card debt. The numbers on that are fantastic. Most people do that. So now they don't have a job. So far, we have lost in excess of 20 million jobs in the United States due to transporter psychosis, and the number just continues to grow. I am not aware of what the current number of people in the job market is, but 20 million plus is a huge jump in unemployment. We are headed back to at least a 2008 economy and potentially far worse. And the worst part about it is now their employers are also going out of business. So even if we stopped what we're doing right now and let people go back to work, a lot of them wouldn't have any back to work to go to because the businesses themselves went under because it's been so long. So the jobless no longer have any money for food. They are cutting back or resorting to food banks, as we are now seeing very long lines for food banks in the United States major metro areas. These pictures here are just a cross-section. I don't do any particular city or any particular state. It's just a bunch of different ones from all over the country. Drop Truth says cattle ranchers in North NSW in Queensland have been bashed by drought and then the current crisis and high and restricted transportation costs. Suicides are rife. Yeah, we could be looking at that in the United States at some point here too. In any case, what happens when people aren't buying food, but rather going for free food as much as they can, the upstream supply chain then suffers. So in the beef industry, here recently, 2 major meat processing plants have shut down in just the last 2 weeks alone. Now, the president and CEO of Smithfield Food, which is one of the nation's largest meat-producing companies, has warned of, quote, severe and possibly disastrous consequences for the country's meat supply chain following the closure of its South Dakota meat processing plant and several other meat processing plants due to not just this bad economics, but also due to transporter psychosis. Let's see here. I'll take a look here. Seems to me like it was all engineered to give over cattle and agriculture to corporations and force the country into the cities living in boxes. That's happening in the U.S. where we're starting to see family farms disappear. And that's because it's no longer possible to simply give the land that you owned or your grandparents owned to your children outright. You have to pay a zark load of taxes. It becomes very difficult to just give it to them. So big companies buy it, and your children get to run it. That's our twisted law in the U.S. It's bad. But they have all these plants closed, and I will quote someone: the closure of this facility, and we're talking about the most recent one in South Dakota, down in Sioux Falls, where I pointed to. Closure of this facility, combined with the growing list of other protein plants that have shuttered across our industry, is pushing our country perilously close to the edge in terms of our meat supply. And this was quote by Kenneth N. Sullivan of Smithfield, and he released that in a press release last Sunday. Further quoting, "It is impossible to keep our grocery stores stocked if our plants are not running. These facility closures will also have severe, perhaps disastrous repercussions for many in the supply chain. First and foremost, our nation's livestock farmers. These farmers have nowhere to send their animals." And this statement comes after the company's pork-producing plant in Sioux Falls was forced to close on April 12th after hundreds of its approximately 3,700 employees tested positive for transporter psychosis. According to Smithfield, this one plant alone accounted for 4 to 5% of the entirety of U.S. pork production. Now, as an aside, I would certainly note there's an interesting thing that I found out today, just recently by doing late research for this. Smithfield Foods is owned by China's biggest meat processor, Shuanghe International Holdings. I'm just going to let that sit there. I don't know if it's meaningful in terms of the fact that they are seeing outbreaks of transporter psychosis, but it is owned by a Chinese company. And Smithfield is not the only major meat processing company that's had to close U.S. Production plants due to transporter psychosis health crisis. Weeks ago, a Purdue Farms processing plant in Delaware temporarily closed for a top-to-bottom cleaning after employees fell ill with transporter psychosis. A Tyson Foods facility in Iowa was forced to suspend operations after more than 24 workers tested positive. And another Tyson facility is under investigation for the same thing in Tennessee. Drop of Truth says, I've enjoyed the chat, but the buffering issue is getting worse. I'll download this later. Okay, feel free to catch me on demand. Thanks very much. I appreciate it. SuperCruise63 says, thanks to the media scare, we're having this problem. More people have died the flu, in the flu than transporter psychosis. You don't want to downplay this because it is bad in places with a very large infection vector like New York City. The rest of us, not so much. And let's see here. Yeah. So while the production slows, the demand for the meat is also falling overall amidst this transporter psychosis pandemic. Again, 20 million people out of work. it's not so much hit the supermarkets just yet, but that's because cuts of meat that are more often served in restaurants that are closed, like steaks, chicken wings, etc., they're seeing the largest decline, while the ones in the aisle, the meat supply in the aisles are not so bad. But that's probably a temporary condition. The transporter psychosis prompted closures could further complicate matters, according to Christine McCracken, an animal protein analyst for Rabobank, a Dutch research facility. She says, and I quote, "There is a huge risk of additional plant closures, and not just because of transporter psychosis, but because people don't have money to buy stuff." That's a huge part of it as well. And this is more disastrous when you consider the food supply chain as I described it to you. When the meat processing plants shut down, then the upstream feedlots can't sell their cows anymore, and they end up holding on to them for far longer than they usually would, while taking it in the shorts for all of the feed grain necessary to keep these thousands of head of cattle alive. And if they can't take it in the shorts, then they're going to have to sell off their cows or kill them, if they can get rid of it in any way, to reduce their operating expenses. And all of this makes their business untenable. And so they are the next ones after the slaughterhouses and the processing plants. After they're down, then go down the feedlots. And then next down the chain is where it all starts with the cow-calf operation, where my family has always been involved. Again, this is where they're allowed to free-range graze for several years before they're being sold. But if the feedlot isn't buying any more cattle, then the ranchers are really taking it in the shorts, because they tend to operate on very tenuous financial means in the first place. Most of them have mortgages on their property that will not be paid off until they retire. And they sort of bank on the idea that the real estate prices are going to increase over time, so that when they sell it, it'll be a large enough asking price that they won't be out on the street panhandling at age 65. So when the feedlots aren't buying, the ranchers have to start selling what cattle they can at extremely reduced prices. And in order to pay their mortgages, they have to sell a lot more of the cattle if they can. As many as they can for as much as they can possibly get, because then they make their operating expenses. But if your upstream buyers aren't buying, you're kind of screwed. You may not be able to sell them at all. And if you can't sell them at all, well, you also can't afford to keep them alive. And you have to euthanize them rather than let them just die a much harsher death than starvation. And it's a lot easier than to herd them into a big ravine and then shoot them all, so they can much more easily be buried in a mass grave that way. And if you don't bury the bodies, well, these hundreds or maybe thousands of rotting corpses will then cause a significant health risk. But any way that you cut it, this means a really significant shortage of breeding stock for the next 10 years, because if all your cattle are freaking dead. See, ranchers have to operate in this little area where you have to have enough so that you can breed more of them and continue to breed more of them and make your stock large enough so that you can make money selling them, and not so large that they eat all the grass that you've got. But then if you have to start selling them off en masse just to make your ends meet, or killing them, that means that your breeding stock has just gone down. If you cut your breeding stock in half, it's going to take you, much more time to build back up to where you're really profitable again. So if the ranch can't make their mortgage, then the banks will foreclose. They always do this. And then the rancher is out on the street, and nobody is raising cattle that was once on their land. This is conceivably a very serious problem for the industry. Let me take a look here. Super Crew, looks like I will have to break out the Winchester and go hunting. My family has somewhere to go if the excrement really hits the airflow device, but I'll speak about that in a minute. So if the industry comes back, and that will mean, at the very least, a massive increase in the price of beef, because by then you will have maybe shot all these cattle, you maybe will have sold them all off earlier on, and now you've got a very small supply, and you have to keep your supply the way it is so that you can breed more of them. So you have a small supply, large demand, the price of beef is going to go way up. However, under the current circumstances, where we have not just shut off our economy, but allowed it to smack into a brick wall at 80 miles an hour, the beef industry may not rebound at all. Because people have no jobs, no money, and no prospect for a job because the business that they used to work for has gone under. And so they're not going to have the money for food that they once did. And that may be a permanent situation. The scenario that I discuss here with beef is also being played out in many areas of agriculture. It's just that I happen to be able to talk about beef with a little bit of authority because of my family history. But in short, the same amount of beef may be there right now, but it's not being sold. And where it's sold, it's being done so at a huge discount, and there are no longer a lot of processing plants even to deliver it to. And so the numbers are going to go down worldwide. The trucks also are consequently not running with beef at the same capacity that they were 3 months ago, and that means the truckers are taking it in the shorts. Ultimately, this boils down to having a gigantic leap in unemployment, people who not only have no financial cushion, but also had massive credit card debt to start with. And this is where we now have runs, as I showed before, on food banks in major cities. At present, the way things are going, I don't see this getting much better. Even if all the governors and mayors everywhere understood the problem, and most of them don't, particularly when you get into major metropolitan areas, they don't understand. And if they stop the quarantines tomorrow, we still have in excess of 20 million people who don't have a job that had one 3 months ago. And the longer they keep everything shut down, then the more people that we will have filing unemployment. I think that we are looking at something that may be called the Greatest Depression. I don't know if we'll pull out of it. The entire agricultural system is grinding to a halt because of this. I no longer see anything really positive coming out of it. I see potentially mass starvation. It depends how things fall in the next few months. If it goes really badly, and I mean really badly, my prediction would be that if you are in North America and don't presently live in a city of 20,000 or less that is immediately adjacent to agricultural land, you would probably starve to death. That would mean, yes, America's great cities will be starved out, though not before food riots cause them to descend into flames. Now, I'm not saying that this will absolutely happen. A lot of variables are going on here. A lot of different things could go on. But we have slammed our economy into a brick wall. We have slammed the world economy into a brick wall. And it may be that we are going to kill more people by slamming it into a brick wall than we would have if we just let transporter psychosis run its course. Now, these deaths, I have to tell you, would also include myself and my immediate family. Although, because we have this cabin and piece of land that still is in our family, we have conceivably somewhere to go if the excrement really hits the airflow device. However, we might well starve before we become self-sufficient. And if the excrement really hits the airflow device, I'll be dead in short order in any case. I take a number of life-saving medications, one of which is required, or death will occur in 4 days. The collapse of the food supply and the widespread starvation of 1 billion or more people will absolutely destroy the distribution mechanism by which I get these drugs. We may well have been better off if we had simply allowed a transporter psychosis to run its course. We are now in a global depression, and we could have worldwide starvation. I don't know. I'm not saying that's going to happen. But I'm saying, looking at the signs right now, it ain't good at all. Let's see. J. Marshall Puzzle says, for want of a nail, a kingdom fell. Yeah, absolutely. Supercruise 63 says, I'm one of the ones that got laid off after 30 years from the same company. I'll be rehired after this crap is over. But I do have a mortgage to pay, so I hope it's over soon. Yeah. I mean, if we started it right back up now, you know, we might get some of those people back to work, some of the 20 million. But that is a staggering amount. It is a staggering amount. I did a calculation earlier on in the stream, and it's still sitting in front of me. Compared to the population of the United States as a whole, 20 million people represents 5.8%, almost 5.9%. I don't know what the workforce is, but when you look at the workforce compared to 20 million, oh my God. I don't know what that figure is, but it's going to be gigantic. Just a gigantic unemployment amount. And I don't know how or how soon you recover from it. I just don't know. And it's going to get worse the longer it goes on. Superguru 63, your company laid off 50? Yeah. I mean, just driving around town here, you know, we don't have... I was mentioning it early on in the stream. Presently, I'll reload the page. Oddly enough, Nebraska is one of the sites that has a really nice map and tells you, breaks things down by county. And if you know the state, you know what county they're talking about. My county, which is largely just my city of Lincoln with a couple of other small towns in it, currently has 81 cases. And so even with that, we don't have any, you know, orders to shelter in place. We are certainly encouraged to stay home and stuff like that. For me, it's really not any change because both my mother and I are kind of introverts by nature. So, okay, we're at home and, but I go driving around and, you know, nothing is open. I can see my doctor. I have a chiropractor now. I'll be seeing him tomorrow. He's wearing a mask all the time. Can't get your hair cut. All of those places are closed. All of the sit-down restaurants are closed. A huge percentage of retail is closed. The fast food places are still open, but they only do drive-thrus. It is having a severe negative impact. And this over in my county, 81 cases. And despite being the second populous county in the state, we are still 5th in terms of the number of cases. And in Nebraska, we've got 1,474 cases as of this counting, with 28 deaths. Although how that breaks out in terms of actual deaths from transporter psychosis or deaths that were complications of transporter psychosis, I do not know. But it's very small. The only odd part about it is that Hall County here is now number 1 in the state with 475 cases for a city that is less than 50,000. I have no idea what's going on in Grand Island, Nebraska. Stay away from there. They have doubled in only about 3 days. I have no idea what's going on in Grand Island. That would be one of the places I would think would have the smallest infection vector, but they're sitting out in the middle of the state, in the middle of nowhere, you know. Even Omaha, with a population of 2 million plus in that county, they only have 280 cases of transporter psychosis. Go figure. You know, the third largest city, only 50,000, has double the number of cases. Very weird. Percent of the workforce, you are in the automobile field. Yeah, yeah, that's also another thing not good to be in. People like to buy cars, and if you don't have any money, you ain't buying no cars. Nobody's going to give you a loan if you have no money. That is pretty much all I have to say about the state of agriculture and the warning signs that we're seeing right now, and the places that we are starting to see the breakdown. The breakdown in terms of the meat processing plants are a big deal, because it has a ripple effect all the way down to where the cattle are first produced, when they're first born and raised and bred. And if that stops, if that becomes a problem, then we have a real serious problem. Not to say that the guys at the feedlots don't also have a huge problem. They do. They have basically the same kind of problem, but if nobody's buying anywhere, it's a real problem. It's a huge problem. Yep, you explained why. Yep, you explained why they laid you off. Yeah, I hear you. That is my, little bit of non-science fiction. Hopefully the worst case scenario is science fiction. I have no idea where it's going to fall out. I just know how there have been years, for example, when beef prices were so low, that my grandparents and other family members had to make the difficult choice to sell a lot more of their herds than they ordinarily would so that they could make their mortgage. And that had a negative impact for many years afterwards because they had a smaller group from which to breed, and so therefore had to keep breeding for several years in order to get the numbers back up. In this sort of situation where nobody's buying, you still have to feed the damn things. You're going to run out of grass, you're going to run out of hay, you're going to run out of grain to feed them in the wintertime. If you're not getting an income, really your only option is to kill a lot of them. And I don't know what else they'd do. If you can't sell them and you can't afford to feed them, can't afford to keep them alive, you just herd them into a ditch and kill them and cover them over with the dirt. That would be about the only thing I can think of. Your nurse friend just said, why? Yeah. I think we've reached a point, and I now have two physicians, two GPs. One that is my own personal GP, and another one who is the brother of my chiropractor, or not brother, his father, my chiropractor, also an MD, who has said outright that we're now at a point where the cure is worse than the disease, and that we have to stop this now. Otherwise, we're just going to have to accept the fact that people who are immunocompromised are going to have problems, and they're probably, some of them are going to die. You can limit it to some extent, but smacking the entire economy, the entire world economy, into a brick wall is really, really bad, and it may be worse than just letting people die. Hate to come to that conclusion, but I think it's probably true, and I've now had two MDs tell me the same thing. So that is my non-science fiction, as I said, or hopefully worst case science fiction scenario, and the warning signs that I'm seeing as somebody who has both a background, some of a background in agriculture in terms of, cattle ranching, while at the same time having 40 years in very large metro areas. I spent, a good 10 years in Chicagoland. So I kind of feel like I have a perspective that a lot of other people don't have. I know, believe it or not, there are people in major metro areas, I've met them, who believe that food is manufactured on site at the grocery store. So that's particularly clueless and kind of dangerous. It's when the grocery stores, if the grocery stores went empty, they're going to be really angry and not understand why they're empty. They're not going to see the upstream part of it, the part that was caused by the fact that we have all these unemployed people who cannot spend their money, and now we have these meat processing plants closing, some due to economic issues, some due to the fact that they actually have spreads of this transporter psychosis there, and that one that's owned by a Chinese company. I'm not going to say that anything happened there intentionally. I think that would be a little bit on the crazy side, but you look at it and you go, isn't that interesting, so. Let's see. H1N1 infected more people, and they had a higher death percentage than transporter psychosis, and we didn't shut down the planet for that. Yeah, there have been other things that have been worse. Dr. Drew Pinsky, he talks about having gotten bird flu a number of years ago when it was going through real badly. Got real sick, he got better. People who are immunocompromised, people like my mother who have other issues, they're at risk. If we got more than 81 cases in Lincoln, which represents about 0.02% of our population, I'd be worrying about it more for her. I might, take over from her, doing things like, she likes to get groceries, so I'd probably take over from her if I thought there was any real danger that she was going to be exposed to it. But there really isn't. Not 1.02% of your population has been exposed, and I don't know if any of them have actually died. There's only 28 deaths in the entire state. I don't. And it's a state of a couple million people. I don't know what the current population of Nebraska is, but it's around 2 million people. We couldn't possibly have a market crash under our former president now, could we? Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of that going along with it too. The press was not about to say anything negative about any sort of pandemic that occurred under a Democratic president. On the other hand, they are more than happy to try to crash the entire world economy over what's happening with a Republican president. And everybody, there's a lot of people who want to get on him. I'm not sure what the hell else you could have done. This sort of thing is bound to happen in a country, especially in New York City, where it's the worst, where you have a very high population density and open borders along the sea, not basically open. I mean, people come through customs and stuff, but they're not tested for anything. Multiple international airports from all over the world, and a population density so dense that if you're living in like a New York brownstone, you're going to be sharing the ventilation system with, 10 other people in the building, 10 other apartments in the building. It's not like those ventilation systems just are by themselves and go off and go to the outside. They get circulated around the entire building. So somebody's got, transporter psychosis in one room, probably it's going to be spread around the whole freaking building. So, of course, you're going to see more. And this is going to happen anytime that you have a bug that is difficult to get rid of. There is no avoiding it. In those major metro areas, it is impossible to avoid. The only way, and I suggest this to people living in New York City particularly, move out. Once this is over, not now, but once this is over, if you want to avoid this happening to you, move out. There is an enormous amount of the country that doesn't mind having you around. Let's see if I can get back to my... as I said, I showed you before, New York, this is you, and this is Sioux Falls. It's about the same geographic area. Just when you move, don't bring your politics with you. That's really all I suggest. What you think works for you doesn't work out here. Come out here to learn what life is like, and check your various prejudices at home, but move out. Move to a place like this, like Nebraska, hell, like Colorado, which has more cases, but is still nothing like New York City. Get out of really dense population centers and find somewhere that's not. The farther away are you from people, the better it will be, because this will happen again. Hopefully, with something that is even less significant than this, but it'll happen again. It can't not happen. It will happen again. Let's see. Yep, that's the media for us. Yeah, I tell you, I do want to mention, I usually separate out the media. You have the media is this overarching thing, but I like to separate out the press. You have entertainment, and from my perspective, entertainment can do whatever the hell they want. If they want to, if Saturday Night Live wants to spend all their time saying negative things about a president, I don't care. It's just entertainment. But when you get the press doing it, that is a whole other thing. And I think you're absolutely right. Having watched this evolve, I think, not that it isn't bad, not that, China in particular didn't have it really bad. But I don't think that if the press had pushed it quite the way that they did, that we would have ground the entire world economy to a halt. Not just ground it to a halt, slammed it into a brick wall at 60 miles an hour. Yeah, mainstream media, as I say, the press. And not so much the the alternative press, the ones that are starting to push them out. Thank God. You're starting to see, sites that are mostly internet based, that don't have these same kinds of, biases, and also don't necessarily have the same kind of restrictions. What I would really like to see would be a website that was an aggregator for citizen journalists. People who basically went to an event, pointed their cameras, and shut up. Just point their camera and shut up. No talking heads. Maybe the person would occasionally say, so that you could hear it, I am at such and such, and you are seeing such and such, and then shut up. Just point your camera and shut up. This is not like commercial TV. Commercial TV, you have to edit, you have to get things down to a certain size, certain length, certain narrative in order to make your, get the commercials and get all the and get all the advertising and make it packaged so that it's slick and looks good and everything. No, no, this is not that medium anymore. You need to understand the internet has totally different rules. And if you know what I'd really like to see is a site that just aggregates citizen journalists so that you can switch between feeds and say, okay, I'm going to watch this, I'm going to watch that, I'm going to watch that with no commentary, so that the person watching can just come to their own conclusions based on what they see. Now, if at the same time you wanted to have an editorial department, well, that's fine. But they can comment about this news after it's gone on. And we don't have to worry about the length. You don't have to care about the length. It doesn't have to be half an hour long. You can have streams that last 3 hours. You can have streams that last 3 minutes. Just aggregate them so that people can choose between what events they want to watch or maybe what cameras they want to watch at a given event. I'd kind of like to see that happen, because you can't trust these journalists in any way to tell the truth. Oh, this scrolls past my lower third. People who are familiar with my show, nothing you see in the press is real. Nothing, and I can prove it with any press story in about 30 minutes. Nothing you see in the press is real. And so the best way to deal with that is by taking them out of it. Put in people who are just pointing their cameras and shutting up. No talking heads, nothing. Just pointing the cameras and shutting up. And let the viewer come to any kind of conclusion that they want to come to. And as a perfect example of something that happened just before I went on today, Supercruise63 says, you go back to watch my video on why you should not believe the press quite a bit. Well, thank you very much. Daughter was amazed, helped open her eyes. Well, I thank you very much. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. Certainly always hope that I have some kind of impact somewhere. So thanks very much, Supercruise63. And thank you, daughter, for me. I'm humbled. Thank you. Interesting thing, because I mean, one of the things that happened just today before I came on, I don't have a picture of it. Oh man, this was amazing. So some local news station, I've forgotten where, you can find it. If you go to my Twitter, I commented on it at length. Twitter at SYLTales, feel free to follow me there. If you go to my Twitter, I commented on it at length. Some local news station was doing a piece where they were, talking to various hairdressers and hairstylists in the area who wanted to go back to work. And it was the reporter covering it was, I've forgotten her name, but this woman who ended the report from inside her own bathroom. And the way that the shot was set up, I recognize it. I recognize it because I see it all the time on YouTube. It wasn't directly facing you, because I don't do that. This is directly facing in front of me. I have my camera pointed at a slight angle. I do that because it helps cover my weight. Women on YouTube do this because they wear things then that show their cleavage. And so the greater the angle, the more cleavage you'll do. So she had this sucker up at a pretty high angle. And she was finishing this by saying, okay, and hopefully in the near future, we won't have to do this. And she pulled over some of her hair and cut it with her scissors, right? In the background, a reflection in the mirror right over her shoulder clearly showed a naked man. Now the reflection was from it was reflecting out of the shower stall, which is also visible. It's like, here's a naked dude on the window in the mirror. Here's the shower stall, and it's like a 45-degree angle, perfect 45-degree angle to the freaking camera, and you can see his legs. They seem to match. And then you've got this 45-degree angle thing. And he was clearly naked. I mean, everything. You can see everything. And I'm like, what the hell? How did that happen by accident? I mean, it must have been an accident, because only an idiot would do that, right? I mean, they risk their career. That sort of thing gets an FCC violation, and the station's fined, and this woman's going to be out on her ass. I suspect she's out on her ass anyway. I would have sent her out on her ass, even if I didn't get fined by the FCC. But you go, what chain of events led to that shot? Right? Here's a woman who's a professional journalist doing a story, a relatively puff story, but doing a story that ends in her bathroom. Why do you not say to your significant other, or your husband, whoever the hell's in the shower, hey, honey, when are you going to be done with the shower? I need to shoot some video. And then when he's done, you go in and set up your cam. Why do you go, honey, can you just shut off the water for a second so that I can shoot this? How do you get to that point? That doesn't make any sense to me. Who would do it? Who does that sort of thing that just says, okay, hang on a second. I just need to shoot this video for about 5 minutes. So shut off the water. You can stay right where you are. You couldn't wait the 10 minutes? No. And again, the way the shot is set up, the mirror, if you look closely, the mirror's on a door. It's one of those, doors for like linen and stuff. So the mirror's on the door, and the mirror happens to be, so like you get, God, how to do this. So you got the shower like this, right? And then there's a wall here, and the door is like right here with a mirror on it. And the door is not closed. The door is at an angle like this, so that it perfectly picks this guy up in profile. If I were a reviewer, because it's go into this review mode sometimes when I see these. If I was a reviewer, I would have said, oh, that was really well put together cinematography. That was well put together. The mirror there is perfectly visible over her shoulder, and you can see this naked guy, standing in it in profile. He's an absolute profile. He's perfectly profile, so that you can make out every contour. Perfectly profile, perfectly positioned mirror. It wasn't 5 degrees to the left or right. It was perfect so that you can see it right there. How do you get to this point? How do you get to the point where I look at it and go, wow, that's some good cinematography. That was put together well, it's lighted well. Everything was exactly where you wanted to see it. But except you didn't want to see it. You have to assume that this was an accident. Nobody would do this on purpose. But it still happened. How does that work? How do you get to that point? How do you, I don't know. But again, looking at it as a reviewer, as somebody who looks at cinematography, I was like, wow, that's a really nicely choreographed shot. It's a well put together shot, lit well so that you can see everything. The mirror isn't, 100%. You can see the outline. It's clear what's there, but it's obscured by the fact that there is, there's condensation on the shower, so that it's not like you're not directly seeing every detail, but you're making out perfectly in profile exactly what it is. Exactly profile, exactly the right angle so that it shows up right over her shoulder. How do you get there? How do you get there by accident? It's just, I can't believe she did it on purpose, but man, the sequence of events that got you to that point by accident, I don't understand. I just don't get it. Anyhow, that's probably an amusing enough anecdote to leave this on. Go check out my Twitter. I've got a link to the video itself. It's on YouTube, at least for a while. Somebody may figure out that there's I don't know if it counts as explicit or not under YouTube's rules, but the video's there now. I downloaded it just on the off chance, and partly too because I wanted to blow the thing way up. It's 1080p, but it's somebody taking a video of the TV screen, so it's not that great. I wanted to blow it way up so that I could see precisely what was going on in the background. So I downloaded it. You might want to download it yourself if you want to keep it. But I suspect we have a journalist whose career is over. How do you get to that shot accidentally? I don't know. Anyway, that is all that I have to say about that. So I would love to keep the conversation going. So please leave your comments, questions, and nasty remarks, and I'll do my best to respond to you. So thanks for watching. That is all the time that we have today for this episode of Tales from SYL Ranch, where everyone is entitled to my opinion. And I'm Bill Stone.
Ultimate power in this world has always been one simple thing: the control and manipulation of minds.